All right, so welcome to this Q&A. Again, we're welcome to this Q&A. A question came in earlier about JIT, called a Jew in Training, my famous Jew in Training. And that is, by a Jew in training, what mitzvahs can they do? What are they allowed to do? In other words, the question was really specifically, can a person, when they wake up in the morning, can they say Modan? And they say, thank God for, keep me alive, right? Bringing my soul back to my body, right? Wash your hands, make blessings, blessings, let's say, before you eat bread or whatever it is. So in general, that shouldn't be a problem. I mean, there are certain things I would say are more, problematic. Certainly for a guy to wear tefillin, right? That would for sure be a problem. It's not Jewish. That should be, a person should learn how to put them on right before conversion. Wearing them before conversion be a problem. Mostly, other things. If let's say, a guy wants to wear tzitzis, right, fringes, whatever you want to call them, should be allowed to. I don't see, why not. Guy wants to wear a kippah on his head, right, yarmulke, whatever you want to call it. Now, some people, will call question to that because they're not Jews, right? Very clear that they're not Jews. Okay, there is a great responsibility, certainly for looking like a Jew, certainly for acting like a Jew. Now, that being said, I have less problem with people dressing the parts than I think some other people, might. I've heard, people say they're not Jewish, they shouldn't represent Judaism until they're a Jew or do it right before. So I think there are certain things. I think I mentioned this last week, but it's always good things bear repeating, and that is that if it's something, let's say by the laws of modesty, yeah. So I think it's going to be harder in a certain way if a person tries to change the way they dress, and the way they look, right before conversion. I mean, it's a gradual. I would say it's probably a gradual type of thing, meaning that the person gonna throw out their old wardrobe, wear a new wardrobe straight away. I don't think so. I think a person has to feel comfortable, doing that. At some point, they have to get there. They have to, they say, dress the way they should, walk the walk and talk the talk. Okay, right? Again, it doesn't have to be straight away. It can be done, certainly in stages. But I would think the earlier start that a person has and they incorporate what they learn into their lives, the easier it will become. In other words, someone, let's say, keeping kosher, good example. Keeping kosher, okay, again, everything is all, practice till you actually, to actually convert, but, getting used to eating certain things or not eating certain things, and then waiting between, meat and milk and, other things, I think, at some point, have to be, implemented. Now, someone will ask, right, it's an obvious question, when, and this is really a personal thing, and that is, when should I be doing this? Right, so what's a good rabbi's answer with a question? When you're ready. When do you think, you feel comfortable or you feel ready to do such a thing? Is it going to be, the very beginning? I don't know. By some people, they may say, I'm going to start, dressing, let's say, more modestly, whatever, and they're going to start from the very beginning. Other people, it'll take time. And now, there's no judgment. There's no judgment on that either way, whenever a person is going to feel comfortable doing that. Now, obviously, they have to do it. I mean, at some point, if you want to be a Jew, there's certain things, you have to do. So you have to look the part. You have to, way, and be part of a community that you feel you identify with, which is not an easy thing. that first of all, when it comes to that, I would always say a person has to, take stock of where they're holding in the world. Who do they, identify with? Do they identify, let's say with the modern Orthodox community? That means, for a guy, they won't wear just white shirts. They won't wear necessarily suits either. Maybe just on Shabbos. You might see somebody, with the yellow shirt, with the blue shirt, with, whatever it is. They're not necessarily going to look like they're dressing in black and white, right? I.e., white shirt, black pants, with or without pinstripes, or dark blue with or without pinstripes, or even dark gray with or without pinstripes, right? So it's not just dress. Dress is part of it, even though I mentioned many times, not necessarily big into externals. You can have people look the part, walk the walk, and talk the talk. They're not very religious per se, or see how they live their lives. And you have other people that, you kind of question. Well, are they really religious at all the way they dress? Right? And they can be more religious than, most other people. It's just they don't dress the part, or they dress what they feel comfortable with. Okay, so dress is one thing. Again, even though I'm not into externals, but there's an overall outlook, right? There's an outlook how I look at the world. Now, again, people are going to differ on this, and that's okay if you're within the boundaries, of Torah, right? So, the ultra Orthodox community will look at the secular world as okay. I have to be there. I have to put money on the table. I have to deal with it. Very good. Okay, so person, will make boundaries. They, most likely probably, won't watch, secular movies or ball games or have very many secular things, in their house. And their outlook is to be part of the secular world, you have no choice, right? You have no choice, right? Even a person who lives in a very strong Jewish community, you're still part of the secular world. You go out, you go somewhere, right? You're still part of the secular world. So you have to deal with the secular world. Okay, but how do we look at it? Do we look at it like, as a means to an end? Or do we look at it and say, well, if I had to be part of it, I'm going to embrace it, right? There's different ways, obviously, of looking at this. Now, the outer Orthodox world will limit things coming into their house or screens, in general, to see appropriate things, because there's other things, as we mentioned many times, by sports, movies, other things, bad values, tremendously bad values, even in cartoons. Even a cartoon, tremendously violent and other things. They're funny. I'm not going to say no. Definitely, definitely funny. But nonetheless, they give off bad values, right? They give off a lot of bad values. So, in the outer Orthodox community, in most cases, they don't have a TV. They don't watch secular things. There's a place to see things that, let's say are kosher. Some won't even look at things that are or less kosher, because then it's Moshe a person. It's then a person moves on to other things, right? Again, I'm just going to generalize. It's not, some people will allow their kids to watch certain things. They won't allow their kids to watch certain things. So making a living obviously is an obligation. You got to be part of the secular world. Very good, but again, it's you have to be there. You have no choice. So you have to know how to navigate it. Whatever. Good. Now the modern Orthodox community is very different. First of all, they dress different, but the mentality is different. Many people, their goal is, I'm going to be the best businessman I can be. I'm going to be the best architect I can be. I'm going to be the best, I don't know, computer science person I can be. Okay, nothing that's like wrong with that. But you have to have Torah in your life also. So what do you mean? I keep Shabbos, I keep kosher, right? But what's the major difference? I mean, I became religious to the modern Orthodox religious Zionist world, as most people probably know. So what makes them different, right? What's the major difference? So let's say I keep Torah mitzvahs. We learn Torah. Torah is very important, right? But some people it's more important, some people less important. Whatever it is, okay. If they keep Shabbos, they keep kosher, that's good. That's good. But what's the most important thing? What's the most important thing that will differentiate the two communities? Yeah, and it'll differentiate them again in a major way. I'm saying not across the board, but in general. What's the major difference, right? There are two major differences. One is how you look at the outside world. That's one major difference. But the other major difference, I think, is more significant, and that is the importance of Torah scholarship, the importance of learning. Now, in that communities, of course, yeah, I go to this class or I go to that class, I listen to this, whatever. Okay, some more, some less, very good, very good, right? In the modern Orthodox community, though, there's a big thing to go to college, right? Go to college, get a degree, right? Because obviously, you need a degree to work, which again, probably one of the top five biggest myths in the world. Plenty of people made money without a college degree. There's certain things you need a college degree for. Okay, right? We've spoken about that, but in general, it's like, well, okay, you got to deal with it, but you know, you got to go to college, you got to learn secular things, you got to be part of the world, this and that. Yeah, whereas the other Orthodox world say, okay, if I have to get a degree, try and do it in the most kosher way possible, in order to advance and work and all that. Very good. But by then, there's one major difference. Major difference is learning is everything. In other words, for better or for worse, how do we look at people? Right? We look at people again, as I said, for better or for worse, what they do. Now, what they do does not, doesn't mean who they are, right? If a person meets somebody, let's say they meet someone for the first time, yeah, there are two obvious questions they're going to ask, right at the outset. The first question is, where are you from? Right? Where are you from, or where'd you grow up? The second question is, what do you do? Right? Those are two major questions. People probably ask at the very beginning. Now, a person can say, I'm a scientist. I don't know, I do graphic arts, I do digital marketing. I'm a doctor, lawyer, accountant, this, that. But that's just what they are. That's just what they do to make money. Yeah, that's what they do to put bread on the table. Okay, but that doesn't define who they are. Yeah. So somebody works, okay. They work, they learn, they, set aside time to learn. Very good. Yeah, in the outer Orthodox community, and most likely, and I'm not saying across the board. I'm not saying everybody. There are plenty of strong learners in the modern Orthodox, community. I'm not saying there aren't. Right, or what they call the Chardal community, right? Haredi Dati Lumi, right? I'm not saying they're not. I'm saying they don't have serious learners, right? I'm saying though a lot of people in that movement, that's not the focus. There are plenty that do. Okay, yeah, yeah, but the focus is on a career for a lot of people. Focus is what I do. Now, does that mean they don't learn? No, I never said that. Right? They can learn, before they pray, after they pray, they can have, time during the day, they can have time at night. Okay. Yeah. You will not find in most cases, someone gets married, in that community, they're sitting and learning after the marriage for X number of years. Some will, 100%. You won't see that in the Hasidic community either. In the Hasidic community, maybe they'll learn for a year or two after marriage, maybe a little bit longer, right? Maybe. But their main focus is business, make money. That's their focus. Their focus is not long-time learning, right? Not by the Hasidic community, certainly not by the modern Orthodox community. Now, some people in the modern Orthodox community, that is an ideal. It's a minority. It's a minority. I don't think there's any question. There's an absolute minority for that. Okay, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Good. So this is a major difference. In other words, someone in the Orthodox community gets married, so they can try and sit and learn as long as possible. Does that mean they get rabbinic ordination or not? I don't know. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Whatever it is, eventually they're going to have to work, right? I mean, unless they're being supported for however long, whatever it is, or the wife's got a very good job, so don't have to do very much, which in most cases they probably will have to do some things on the side or whatever. Okay. But at the end of the day, the main focus is learning. That's the main focus. Everything else, okay, you got to get a job, you got to do something, you got to plan. Right? Now, again, does that mean you have to get a degree? No. You don't have to get a degree. Right? But parents of modern Orthodox kids, yeah, their thing is my kid to be a professional. If they had a choice, what would I rather my son be? Doctor, lawyer, accountant, or rabbi? Yeah? What would they choose? The vast majority of people would choose the top three. Majority. Some people say, yeah, I want my son to be a rabbi. Okay. Or a rabbi doctor. Or, not necessarily, a medical doctor, right? It could be, whatever. It's PhD, whatever. Okay. Yeah, that's the case. I don't think it's changed over the years. There are some serious people, good. There are some serious people that, the thing that kids should learn for a long time. Very good in that community. It's not the majority. It's certainly not, it's certainly not the majority. But at the end of the day, it's a major difference. So a number of years ago, right, we'll just play this out, how this works. A number of years ago, there was they here in Israel for the chief rabbinate, they elected 22 dayanim. Dayanim are rabbinic court judges, right? So 22 rabbinic court judges were appointed. Now, out of those 22, 15 out of 22 came from the ultra-Orthodox camp. Now, a person could say, now that's 58%, almost 59%. Yeah, we'll round it up. It's almost 60%, right? We'll make it an even number. Yeah, now, that being the case, person could say it's discrimination. They only want people from that community. I just, I see signs every day that they're looking for people, anyone interested to learn, to be a dayan, to be a rabbinic court judge. It takes years. It takes many, many years. I remember years ago, many, many years ago. Yeah, there was a place advertised looking for people to learn dayanis, to be a rabbinic court judge, which means there's a lot to learn. You have to learn the laws of damages, the laws of loans and divorce and marriage and all kinds of other things, right? Most of the laws of damage, right? Most of the laws, of the damage, that's huge. You're talking major, major tractates, learning and learning in depth. In any case, they wanted you they're going to pay pretty nice every month, nice stipend, but they wanted you to learn for 10 years. But that's the only thing you were going to learn, right? Day in and day out for 10 years. Now, they need rabbinic court judges, no question. Yeah, and it's a very intense thing, to learn. But they wanted people dedicating their lives for 10 years around the clock learning this and nothing else. Right? So I thought about doing it. I had money, it wouldn't have been a problem. Could have sat and learned. Could have gone that route, but 10 years is a long time. 10 years is a long time to commit. I understand what you come out with. Okay. But, at the end of the day, now, I'll explain a little background also. But what happens is that obviously you have to take requisite exams, right, in order to pass. Very good. Now, just because you pass the exams, now my Rabbi would say, okay, so now, you need to be by someone, you need to see things in action. You have the book savvy, a lot about what the laws are and how they work, and very good. But they shouldn't be chosen. They should be chosen by, Torah giants of the generation, right? His knock against it was they're not political appointments by any stretch. You have to know a lot to do it. I sat in a rabbinical court for 5 years, saw the judges in action. Whatever. You have to have a lot of knowledge. You have a lot of knowledge and what cases are coming in front of you, and how the Gemara dealt with it, and how the early commentators dealt with it, and it's similar, it's not similar, and how it works, and what about what about what do you call it? What about in general, how these things work. What about the law of the land, right? Sometimes the question came up, and they said you got to ask, an expert in this field. We're going to ask an expert, in this field, right? In other words, you got to see, it's not, some things weren't clear cut, or they were clear cut, but they weren't experts in certain things. So they said you have to bring someone in, and they had their own experts also, right? They would say, go to this person, go to that person, see what they say, see what they evaluate, and, then come back to us, but the knowledge itself, is one thing. So you can ask the question, you say it's discrimination or whatever. And nothing to do with discrimination. It's a question of, does the person have the requisite knowledge or not? Now, if in one community, and this is the ultra-Orthodox community, if in one community, the main focus of who anybody is, or how you rate, quote unquote, anybody, not a good thing to do necessarily, but how do you rate somebody in the secular world, or quote unquote judge them, which, we shouldn't judge. What do we judge a person by? Not the way they look. Nobody cares how you dress. Person dresses in a nicer suit, not a nicer suit. Okay, right? But how do you judge someone? How do you look at someone? What's their value to Judaism in a certain way is what they know. And it's what level of what they know. Yeah. So therefore, if a person can't learn or they don't like to learn, okay, so and a little bit learn, meaning now, food, mean in general. Putting food on the table means that okay, you got to work. That's what it means. Whether it's a 9 to 5 job, 8 to 6, 7 to 4, right? Or you have to work all night, whatever it is. You got to do something. Person's got to do something, obviously, to make money. Good. Now, so your permissibility not to learn is obviously working. So if you're working, again, if you can learn at the same time, listen to things, very good. If you can't, you can't, right? But you have to have fixed time to learn. The only permissibility to not be able to learn is if you're working, or let's say you can't, you're tired, whatever. But if you're working, that gives you the ability, right, to be exempt from learning. When you're not working, then you should be learning. What do you got? Family responsibilities. Okay, so you have to have fixed time. You have to have fixed time. Now they have a lot of great programs where people work and they learn. They learn. Let's say pay someone a week, but very well. They have a class on it. They review it, and they review it again. They review it a third time, and they go on to the next page, and then they keep reviewing whatever. It's called acquisition of Torah. They call it kinyan halacha, kinyan gemara, whatever it is. So over time, they get tested on every month. They get tested. Let's say 20 pages on 10 pages on whatever it is. But first of all, it gives them something to shoot for. Again, they have limited time, but they make the time. Like this is important, and just instead of learning a little bit here, a little bit there, this is more more focused. Okay, right? So good. So the only purpose not to learn is if you're working. Okay. Now, when you're not working, so you're gonna find time to learn either after you pray, before, right? Sometime during the day you have to find time to learn. And that's it, right? If you can learn more, good. If you can't, you only have a certain amount of time. Okay. So you need people to work because you need people to support yeshivas and girls' schools, and for needy brides and like all kinds of things. So you need people to work, right? That's no question. That's no question. So, but what do we look at again, for better or for worse? What are we looking at as the most important thing? The most important thing is to learn. Yeah, to be the best Jew you can be. Now, does that mean every person that's sitting and learning is going to be able to go out and influence others and be a rabbi and this and that? Not necessarily, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that. You got brilliant people that can't teach. Definitely seen it, seen it in action, meaning that if you can't explain something to a 5-year-old, in a certain way, then you can't give over to others. I mean, they might be brilliant. They might be, Talmudic geniuses. Okay. Yeah. Again, being a genius, giving it over to others and explaining, to their level, that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand. But in any case, what's the most important thing? Is scholarship. It's Torah scholarship. What a person knows. Now again, in the modern Orthodox community, is that important? It's important. I'm not going to say it's not important. In some communities, extremely important. Very good. No different than the ultra-Orthodox community. Okay. Again, I'll go on record saying they have strong places of learning also. And they have people that sit and learn for a number of years after they're married. Very good. Is it the majority? No. It's not the majority. Not even close to the majority. Yeah. It's not an ideal by most people. Right? So there's a big difference here. It's a major difference. Right? It's a major difference. And people say, well, I have fixed times to learn. Okay. But there's a value. They'll say, well, not everyone can sit and learn. If a person wants to do it, their wife's on board, the family's on board, they're able to do it for however long. So all the power to them. Why not? What's the problem? Eventually they're going to have to do something. Okay. But, that's the power of the Jewish people. You need people sitting and learning. The mistake, people make is they'll say there's so many people, sitting and learning. Yeah. That, even in the time of King David, there was a standing army. You always needed a standing army. But the power of the standing army is only as good as the people, who are learning for them and protecting them. If we would do our job while learning, no Jew would die in the army. Nobody. Right? Someone came to the Brisker Rub and said, during the 6-Day War, it was an absolute miracle. It was an absolute miracle. They were preparing 50, 60, 70,000 body bags, and only a few thousand people died. Right? I shouldn't say whatever, like 3,000 people, a little less, probably 2,800, 2,900, something like that. So yeah, that is miraculous, no question. I mean, it's too many people that died. Even if one person died, it's too many. But this is what the Brisker Rov said. The Brisker Rov said, that's not enough. Had we done what we're supposed to do in learning and in prayer and in other things, nobody would have died. Not a few hundred, not 1,000, nobody would have died. So you need both. Yeah, you need both. This whole point is not about whether, we should do the army, shouldn't do the army. That's a whole nother discussion. It's a whole nother discussion. But the pivotal idea is that, of course, you need an army of people learning, right? You also, people who work should be looked down upon, even though sometimes they are. It's like, oh, we can't learn or whatever. Some people can't learn. Some people it's just hard for them. Okay. Yeah. But again, the permissibility for someone to work, right, is okay. You're allowed to provide for yourself, your family, very good. Yeah. But you got to have fixed times to learn, right? A guy has to have fixed times to learn. Woman doesn't have that obligation. I mean, she's also learned, but she doesn't have the same obligation. Very good. This is a major difference. Major difference. So a person's looking, let's say, for a community, right? A non-Jew is looking for a community. First of all, where am I holding the world? That where do I fit in? Which community, which worldview, right, would I fit in? That's something someone has to think about. Again, it could change over time. For sure, it could change over time. But that's the question. Where do I fit in? Where is my mentality? Is it in a more modern place in a sense where they dress differently, their outlook's different, or there's no other side. A person can be Hasidic, okay. I'm not saying a person can't be Hasidic. That's part of the ultra Orthodox community also. That there's they dress a little bit different, but doesn't matter. Their outlook is somewhat, it's definitely similar in many ways. They differ on how long the person's going to learn after marriage, right? Someone who's Hasidic, unless they're really into learning or whatever, they'll try and learn longer, right? Most people in the Hasidic community, a couple of years, and they're out. In Chabad, what will they do? They'll learn for a number of years, get smicha, get rabbinic ordination, and then go to some far-flung place and work with Jews that don't know anything about, Judaism. That's their thing. Right? That's what we call shlichus, right? They're being sent out, right, so to speak. They're being, sent out. That's what the Rabbi wanted. He wanted people to, be all over the world, influencing secular Jews. Okay, there's what to be said for that. So that's their thing. A person feels, that's for them, and that's what they want to believe in, and that's the direction they want to. Something. The most important thing, in general, is going to be where do I see myself, right? Where am I going to, fit in the bigger picture? Then the second part of that's going to be where, can I find a community, like that, where I live or near where I live, or am I going to have to move, right? That's going to be, that is going to be, that's going to be the question, right? So again, there is a, there is a major difference, major difference of, how some people are, going to look at the world, look at the world in the sense of, what's the most important thing? How am I going to dress? Am I going to find people, with that same, same mentality? Again, even within, let's say again, even within, let's say the non-Orthodox Hardal community, let's say Haredi Dati Lumi community, are there more serious, communities than others when it comes to learning? Yes, no question, right? That there's no question. Yeah, so you can find them, within communities, right? Even let's say in the Orthodox community. You find communities within communities. Same thing. In some places, maybe, people that are more affluent, you have more people that work than learn. Some places, maybe you have more people that learn than work. Or maybe there's a mixture, right? Maybe there's a mixture, So where I live is a mixture. It's definitely a mixture. You got a lot of people sitting and learning full time, right? But you have plenty of people that work. So, it's definitely a mixture. So again, it depends. It depends where a person, is going to find themselves, where they, or what they, what they relate to. So a person just has to realize what's out there, right? Obviously, I think one way is better, than the other. I've seen both sides. I think one works a lot better than the other. That's why I've been part of this community for the last 30 years. The ultra Orthodox community. I'm not saying the other community doesn't have, serious people. I'm not saying that. Yeah, there are. There definitely are. Is it the majority of them? No. Definitely, definitely not the majority. Definitely not the majority. So I want to just clarify that. Somebody asked, and someone is a Jew. Okay, if they are a Jew, follow Sephardic, Minchag with Breslov Hashkafa. Breslov, what do you call it? What do you call Hashkafa? Jewish philosophy. Yeah, Jewish philosophy. Influence. Customs, Breslov Jewish ideology. What does it really mean? So I'm going to tell you it's very hard. Let's say someone's Hasidic. They belong to some, I don't know, some group of Hasidus. Breslov is one type of Hasidus. Okay. Right, but whatever, different type of Hasidus. Yeah, let's say, let's say you got, Carl right? You have Modichov, you have, I mean, you have a lot. Can some of those overlap into others? In other words, if someone is of a particular Hasidus, can they take on customs of another Hasidus? Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. You have people today, let's just give an example. You have people today in what we'll call Lithuanian Litvish yeshivas that they're learning, many learn, the classical works of Musar, Path of the Just, the ways of the righteous, gates of repentance, they'll read different things in Jewish philosophy, etc. But one thing, there's been a trend over the years that there are people learning Hasidic Sfarim, right? They're learning, let's say, Nesiva Shalom, right? It's written by the authors by the last Baba Rabbi of blessed memory, and not the current one, but the previous one that recently passed away a number of years ago. And whatever, it's very deep, right? Very deep, very deep ideas, in Hasidus. So why would someone who's, like quote unquote a Lithuanian Jew, why would they learn Hasidus? Okay, they want to learn Nefesh Chaim. I mean, a lot of it by Rav Chaim Volozhin, famous student of the Vilna Gaon, more than 300 years ago, right, was, most people only learn the fourth gate of Nefesh Chaim, which is all about the importance of learning Torah, right? Most people don't touch the first three gates, so a lot of it very much steeped in Kabbalah. Yeah, or Derech Hashem, the way of God by the Ramchal. Very much, steeped in Kabbalah. But I think it's an absolute game changer of a book, of why God created the world, the purpose of man, what the world looked like before Adam and Eve ate from the tree, suffering, like all, spiritual forces. I mean, a very basic book. I think people should learn, even though I don't think most Orthodox Jews learn it. It's a hard book to go through, right? That's true, right? But in general, why would, let's say, a Lithuanian Jew learn Chassidus? Why would they learn Tanya? Why would they learn, a lot of people learning Tanya today from the Baal Tanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, blessed memory. Okay, so that's not such an easy book to go through. Certainly in Chassidus, wouldn't be the first book I would tell someone to go through if they were learning Chassidus, but nonetheless, it's a mixture of Chassidus and Kabbalah. So whatever, it's a deep book. So why the change? Why, let's say, in the last 10 years, 15 years, maybe more? Why has there been, a gradual change from, these Lithuanian students to learn Hasidus? Again, it's not part of the curriculum, right? Certainly not part of, of the yeshiva curriculum. But why would they learn it, right? Because they want to learn things that are deeper. They want to get deeper. They want to have, I want to say, more meaning. They don't want Torah to be so dry in many ways. Because if you're learning, okay, or another page, another commentator, more in depth, less in depth, this, that, it sounds like a grind, right? It sounds like a major grind. Okay. I mean, you are uplifting the world, very good. So, but sometimes the person wants to, get deeper things. I'm not talking about Kabbalah. Kabbalah's off limits. Kabbalah would be totally off limits, right? But there are different, deeper things. Maybe, in Chumash, and they have time to learn Chumash to learn, the explanation of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, right? A lot of his things, a lot of his explanations very deep. Or, go through the Ramban. A lot of things that the Ramban says also, is not just simple explanation, right? He'll go through Kabbalistic things or, deeper ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. 100% there's nothing wrong with that, but there's been a trend that obviously we're not machines, right? Obviously, we need to look, because of everything going on in the world and other things that, people want to have, deeper understanding of things. So they look to learn books that, again, not steeped in Kabbalah per se, but will give deeper explanation of a lot of different things, of Chumash and whatever it is. There are a lot of people today who are in the books of Shimshon Pincus of blessed memory. He was a rabbi in Ofakim down south. Whatever, born and bred, I think, in Brooklyn, in New York, and his books on Chumash and on prayer and on other things, very, very deep. Right, he was very, very much very much steeped in Kabbalah. He died, whatever, many years ago, whatever, relatively young. So there are people that that learn his books, that want to have deeper insight. Victor Miller, blessed memory, was famous, 60s and 70s, and 80s, whatever, for his tapes. He gave a Thursday night schmooze, and right. So now there's a whole group where they're producing, they're going through like a lot of his tapes on, similar topics, and they're producing as part of the parsha every week. They put these things out. It's called Torahs of Victor. I mean, also like, he spoke, very, very strong. I mean, he was very big. He was very big. I quote him all the time. He was very big in, learning the Chovos Halevovos and duties of the heart. I mean, he lived it, right? He lived what the Chovos Halevovos said. So, people learn that. People like to learn. Let's say, on the Torah portion of the week, Rabbi Biederman, he should be well. He's Hasidic, and he whatever they print it out. You can subscribe to it. They print it in whatever, I don't know, a number of different languages. Obviously English being one of them, and he's got amazing insights. Again, he's a lot of the people he's quoting, happen to be Hasidic rabbis of previous generations, or even this generation. But looking at the Torah, okay, as as a chassid, we look at it, different dimensions of what the Torah says. It's got a lot of, I mentioned a number of his stories. It's got a lot of, a lot of good stories, a lot of meaningful things, that he brings out. Where his big thing, week in and week out, I mean, is basically working on Emunah. It's working on your faith and belief in God. Again, he's got a lot of stories to back it up, and it's unbelievable. So I usually say things from what he says over at at the Shabbos table, but whatever. People don't want just simple explanations, nice words, this, that. People want deeper things, right? So there, as we said, there has been a change. There has been a change, over the years. So now the question, or let's go back to the question, if someone, let's say, they want to go, they're Sephardic. Yeah, let's make it easy. They're Sephardic. Okay. So Sephardic people have specific customs, right? I'd say 99% we all agree, right? Ashkenazim and Sephardic people, they, certain customs they have that are different, very good. Right? That's, doesn't contradict anything. Yeah. So the question is, they want to be Sephardic. They want to be Sephardic, but they like Breslov. They like to sing and dance more. I don't know. Right? Whatever it is. Right? Can they follow Breslov philosophy? One of the things by Breslov is, every so often, they'll go pray in the woods. I don't know about going to Uman and any of that. Not, I'm not speaking about that per se. I'm saying, let's say, once a week, twice a week, they want to go pray in the woods. Okay. But, you still have to pray with a minion with 10 men. Right. So let's say they want to take certain things from them. And I mean, it's not a problem. I mean, we do it all the time. I mean, people do not, even if they're Litvish, even if they're Lithuanian, they're not, if they have a certain Jewish, philosophical outlook, they don't just take from one person. They're, they might be a hybrid of, a lot of different people, that they learned from. Not saying they had the same necessarily the same, the same style. So for instance, most people know what my Rabbi is, Moshe Sternbuch, it should be well. So it's interesting. His father was Hasidic, but his father died when he was like 8 or 9 years old. And he developed a connection to like a lot of the great rabbis of the previous generation, Litvish and Hasidic. Yeah, Litvish and Hasidic. So he dresses like a Hasid, but he's an 8th generation descendant of the Vilna Gaon through his mother. Right? Again, not through his father, through his mother. So he's like a total hybrid, right? In many ways. He's very close to the Briskerov. He's very close to the Chazon Ish. very beyond, but he's also very close to a lot of Rebbes. He's very close to the Klausenberger Rebbe, blessed memory, the Satmar Rebbe, the Rebbe of Chibin. I mean, there are a lot of Rebbes he was close to also. He's close to basically everybody, everybody of the last generation. Yeah, all the Torah giants, whether Hasidic or Litvish. Right? Now there's some things he does according to Hasidic tradition. Yeah. Yeah, most things he's very Litvish. So where does he pick and choose? I don't know. I don't know. But he's very big into he doesn't have a tish, he doesn't do, like on a Friday night where he'll sit at a table and he'll say over, all kinds of sermons and give out food. Like, okay, he's not Hasidic in that sense. He's not a Hasidic Rebbe by any stretch. But at the same time, doesn't mean he doesn't know their books, right? He'll quote Hasidic books. So obviously he went through them. Obviously he understands them. Yeah. So I learned a lot of Torah from him. Most of my Torah is probably from him. I learned a lot of Torah from Brevdo, blessed memory, and he also American, but he also spoke, very, very strong, in Musar and in ethics. And Rav Victor Miller learned, quite a bit from him also. But again, person's not just learning from one person, from one person. It could be a hybrid, It's a lot of things that Rav Shimshon Pincus brings down. It's very, very inspiring. Rav Biederman, whatever. Again, am I going to be Hasidic? No. Right? That's not going to change. That's not going to change. But if someone wants to go in a certain direction philosophically, as long as it's not problematic, yeah, but they're holding to other traditions, that's not a problem. Right? We're certainly not gonna look at that as a that's not gonna be an issue. That should not be that shouldn't be an issue. Yeah, let me see. There are other questions here. 1 second. Yeah, let me see. 1 second. What do we mean by Rebbe? Good question. There were different branches of Hasidus. Now, Hasidus, the Nefesh Chaim, or Chaim of Volozhin, and his Rebbe, the Vilna Gaon, at that time, you're talking 300 years ago, were very much against Hasidus. What was the beginning of Hasidus? What did they do? They pretty much learned Musar all day. That's what they did. So they sang and they danced. They went, they did probably meditation, I'm sure. Probably went to the forest to pray sometimes, using different elements to draw closer, draw closer to God. Very good. But what was their attack back then? Their attack back then, Rav Chaim Volozhin says, and Nefesh Chaim and Shar Dalit, in the fourth gate, the problem was that he said if you go into a Hasidic community, you walked into their synagogue or their study hall or whatever, you would only find Musar books. You wouldn't find Gemaras there, right? You wouldn't find books of the commentaries of the Gemara. You'd be lucky to find one set of Gemara in the whole place. That was that Rav Chaim Volozhin says very clearly that was his knock against them at that time. In other words, you want to sing a dance, you want to learn Musar, okay, it has its place. Everyone agrees it has its place. Yeah, but that's not what the focus should be. Yeah, you want to learn 20 minutes a day, half an hour a day. Let's say most yeshivas today, they learn Musar for about a half an hour. I think about a half an hour a day or 20 minutes, whatever it is. Very crucial for character development. No question. Everyone should learn Musar, right? Every day. Everyone should learn. Yeah, even 10 minutes a day is good. Yeah, gives you purpose. Knowing, you have to be better, you have to work on things. Very good. But if you're going to learn it all day, and that your main focus is going to be on character development, then what's going to happen? These communities might produce upright and fine people that are, very strict in modesty and very strict in character development and all these things, but they're never going to know anything. They're never really going to, they're never going to produce Torah scholars. That was the problem. In other words, the only way you're going to produce Torah scholars is people sit and learn. And they're going to learn the source, right? And what's the source? The source is Gemara. That's the source. You got to learn it backwards and forwards, inside and out, early commentaries, later commentaries, till you get to the practical law, right? That's the base of what we do. That's the absolute base of what we do. But if you're only going to learn Musar, you're not going to produce anything. Again, you'll produce people that are into Musar, okay. And there were different types of yeshivas that, when it came to Musar, there are certain places were very, very big on, on cleanliness, tidiness, being on time. Even Ramosh Schneider, bless him, my Rebbe's Rebbe, wasn't Hasidic by any stretch. But he held, prayers in the morning were at a certain time. So he told the students that if you don't get there, if you don't get there on time, don't go anywhere else to pray. Right? Pray by yourself. It's a big thing to pray with a minyan. Pray with 10 men. It's considered a community. God looks at those prayers different than if you pray by yourself. Okay. So why did he say that? He said because if they go pray somewhere else and they pray later, even if they pray with a minyan, it doesn't matter. The people that work are going to say, "Oh, see, she just doesn't get up late. They don't, they can get up late and pray whenever they want. So I can also do that." So it's bad influence. So he would tell them. He would tell them better to pray by yourself than pray at a later minyan. Now, most people today probably would not say that because, if you live in a very strong Jewish community, so you can have places that pray later or whatever, and then, a person comes to learn if they get up late or, whatever the case is. Obviously, the head of any yeshiva is going to want his students to be there. So, if davening starts, prayer starts at 7:30, he wants them there. He wants them there by 7:30. Okay, they stroll in 7:35, 7:40, but they're there. Okay. So the question is, how much on top of them are they going to get, that they have to adhere to? Obviously they have to be there, right? They should be there. Now, are they going to penalize them not penalize them, but, they're going to give them muster about the fact they prayed later and then they came? And that's going to be, a bad influence? They could. They could, but, we live in such a cream puff generation, unless it's like on a regular basis, they're probably not going to say very much. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Again, it depends. It depends. But, the whole success of a person during the day, and certainly in learning, is going to be how they pray in the morning. Now, again, people are half asleep, less asleep, whatever it is. Okay, but that's the Pesach. That is that's the opening. So in Europe and in Russia, so they had different dynasties, right? We'll call them dynasties for lack of a better term. They had different, dynasties. A lot of this stems from the Baal Shem Tov. It was during the 1800s, and a lot of his students and his students, I guess diversified, and they had their students and whatever. So, it wasn't just, one group, but they were, they were spread out, all over Russia. You had the dynasty of Lubavitch, right? That, so it came from the place called Lubavitch, right? In Russia, I think it was. So you had that Hasidic dynasty. You had, other Hasidic dynasties that came from different places, and a lot of these dynasties, even though the places probably moved around and some exist, maybe some don't exist, but they named the dynasty after the place they were, right? So, Karlin or Stolen, whatever, it was a certain place. Yeah, Modich was was a certain place. So, other Hasidus were a certain place, right? So some of them came from that place, and then and then there were different, different dynasties who, usually it's usually inherited, the dynasty, meaning usually a son or son-in-law, after the head rabbi, what they call the Rebbe, after he passes away. So then there's a question: who succeeds? Who's going to succeed? It's going to be the son. It's going to be son-in-law. What if they have a number of sons? Maybe they're going to split off. Maybe maybe not. Maybe they're going to have two distinct ones instead of one. And how they're going to do it? Someone goes someone else. I don't know. Whatever it's, whatever it is. A lot of it is where they came from, and not everyone, perhaps they were, not all the same. If you ever see pictures of what we call a fedora, a strimal, right? Some are round, right? Some are round. Some, most of them are round because they have to fit on your head. But some in different shapes or whatever. So again, why are they doing that? Because that was the custom back in the day. So they didn't change it. But you have these groups all over the world, and they're going to stay with the same name. They're going to stay with the same name as from most likely from where they stem from. That's where it comes from. But the idea of a rebbe in general is the difference between a rabbi, and a rebbe. What's the difference? What's the difference? The rebbe is someone who's like the grand rabbi of some Hasidus, right? Some group of Hasidus. They call him the rebbe, right? And they'll address him as rebbe. Yeah, someone who's a Rav, again, I'm not going to go Webster's definition here exactly. A Rav could be a rabbi of a community. Yeah. I mean, rabbi just means teacher. So it could be, he's a rabbi of a community, or it could be he's got, rabbinic supervision, rabbinic ordination, whether he uses it or not. He could be called rabbi. He could be called rabbi, but there's a very big distinction between, a rebbe who's considered like the grand rabbi, like he's got the final say. He's got the final say, of the, different customs and different things, and what he wants people to do. Then, other rabbis within the group itself. In other words, he's the one in charge. He's the grand rabbi, whether he's the son of the previous Rebbe or he's, son-in-law, whatever, he can also pass it down through that, through a son-in-law. I mean, you have yeshivas like that also, like in the Mir. The Mir yeshiva, like basically anyone who teaches there are basically all related, right? They're basically, they're basically all related. It's very, very rare if you're going to find someone who's going to teach there, here, or let's say in New York, it's probably one of the biggest yeshivas in the world, probably 6,000-7,000 students there, unmarried and married together. But most likely the people that are teaching there, I mean, they have a lot of different, class going on during the day. But the main people that are teaching there are, family members. My Rebbe started his yeshiva, so 13 years ago. Basically 13 years ago, he started when he was 87. And basically the main people, I mean, obviously he's got a son there that's probably, after he should pass away, whenever, should live to 120, it's going to take over for him. But basically everyone who's part of the yeshiva, in general, they're all family members, right? There could be other people not necessarily family members, but most people are probably family members. So a lot of these type of, yeshivas or Hasidic dynasties, it's all, it's all one group. It's all one, it's all one family. Whether, again, it's father, son, grandson, or it could be son-in-laws. I mean, whatever, right? It's basically all the same. It's all the same family, and it makes sense. It makes sense if you have a dynasty like that. It definitely makes sense, because even though you can say, well, maybe they're family issues. How you're going to teach this? You're going to teach that. You're going to do other things, but in general, they're probably most likely on the same. They're all on the same page, so it makes it easy. You don't have any, you don't have outside issues with people, people coming in. You keep it, you keep it within. I'm not saying every yeshiva is like that. A lot of them though, are. You can have sons, son-in-laws, whatever, teaching there, and they're going to be the ones, they're going to be ones to carry it on. So that would be my short, long answer. Somebody asks, what does it mean? Let the voice of Yahweh be heard, the beautiful tense of Shay. Good question. Um, um, what exactly? Um, what exactly does that mean? Um, 1 second. So the question is, let the voice of Yefet be heard. Right. Yeah, so 1 second. Yeah, so one thing we see is that um it's brought down in Genesis. Let's see one thing here. 1 second. Mm, yeah, so that is Genesis chapter 9, verses 26 to 27. Right? The Torah says very clear. It says, and the Lord blessed be he, the Lord God of Shem, let Canaan be their servant, because what happened with Ham, right? That his offspring get cursed forever. God should enlarge Yefes, he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, let Canaan be their servant. So Yefet, as we see, is praised. Shem is given more, let's say, more important designation, right, so to speak. Now, what does Yefes mean in general? What does the word Yafeh mean? It means beautiful, right? It means beauty, right? Usually when we think of Yefes or something beautiful, we think of aesthetics, right? We think of aesthetics. And what did he do? What was his merit? He covered his father's nakedness. Again, not necessarily because of beauty or aesthetics or whatever, right? He did it not to embarrass him, right? Certainly not to, embarrass him. Now, Yefes, we understand, is Greece. Later becomes Greece. Now, what does Greece represent? Greece represents, what do you call it? Greece represents worship of the body. Yeah, today, or worship of beauty, worship of the body, today it represents the Western world. So, beauty again is vanity, in general. So, there are no values, no real values. To it, there are no limits, so to speak. So then anything you do, as we always say, morality is relative. So anything you do is considered like, okay, It's relative. You want to do it, do it. You don't want to do it, you feel like doing it. Okay, what does shame represent? Right? Shame really literally means name. But what does it represent? Serving God. Right? Now, what was his perception? What did he bring to the world? Absolute values. Because the Torah says, the Lord, the God of shame. Right? So what does shame do? He covers his father's nakedness. Why? Both shame and Yefes covers nakedness. Why does shame do it? Because modesty is an absolute value in and of itself. So therefore, even if they didn't see him naked, there would have been a problem, right? In general, there would have been a problem. There would have been a problem with their seeing their father's nakedness. So therefore, you got to be modest, right? So that's the difference between between shame and Yefes. Very good. Now, we mentioned about the beauty, of Greece, right? That's what it represents. So the Gemara says, Gemara Megillah brings down that, again, this idea. May the beauty of Yefet reside in the tents of shame. What's the connection, right? That's the question. What is the connection? So what does it do? It links Yefet and shame, right? It links them together. And it links them through not just because they're brothers, but it links them also through their descendants, i.e., who comes out of shame? Jewish people, right? Abraham comes from shame. Seemingly comes from shame. Right? It comes the Jewish people. So you have Greece and you have the Jewish people. Now, the relationship not so simple though, right? Because you see, you have conflict. Right? Where do you have the conflict? Most obviously by Hanukkah. Certainly by Hanukkah, where the Greeks, they're all about worship of the body and paganism and all that, and they're out to destroy the Jewish people, not physically. I mean, they wanted to take over or whatever, but they wanted the Jewish people to be like them, to worship the body, right, and all that. So again, these two, they clashed, right? Their future civilizations are going to clash, So then the question is, how can the beauty of Greek culture reside, harmoniously in the tents of the Jewish people? In other words, contradiction in terms. Either you worship the body, you go after the physical bodies, we always say, right? In other words, you're going to do what the body tells you, regardless of the intellect. And the Jewish people are going to hold the Torah mitzvahs, right? So you have conflict. You have major conflict over here. So there is a major conflict over here, and the only time you're really allowed to learn Greek philosophy, right, is that you have to find an hour that's neither day nor night, and then you can study Greek wisdom. Well, kind of like at twilight, so you really can't study it, right? It seems that Greek wisdom you wouldn't be allowed to study. And again, what's the worry? The worry is the outward appeal, and beauty of Greek wisdom is going to lure the generation, right? It's going to have people go astray. We see that in the Western world, nothing to talk about, right? That is the case. Just total hedonism, do whatever you want. I'm okay, you're okay. Morality is relative, i.e., relative moral relativism, as it's called. And, the Gemara says also, Baba Kama, 82b, that a person will be cursed if you teach a son Greek wisdom. Again, if the person needs to learn something for a job, this and that, okay, we're talking about learning wisdom for wisdom's sake, right? In general, right? But what's the language of the decree? The language of the decree is, I'll teach Greek wisdom, right? That's the problem, wisdom, right? In other words, study it, but not necessarily teach it. So you got to have solid base in Torah, and then you want to learn these other things. Okay, but you have to have a solid base. And again, there's another thing. As the Gemara says about Bakam 83a, that there's a difference between Greek language and Greek wisdom. Again, between style and content. Wisdom is what? How I look at the world. Philosophy. Yeah. How I look at the world. And just basically what defiles the holy. Greek language, no big deal. You want to learn it. It's not going to affect you. You're just learning the language. Okay, you're not learning anything else about the philosophy, how it's going to influence you, and all that. But at the end of the day, to the Jewish people, and this is a major thing, right? This is a major thing, that we need to borrow, foreign cultures with our own traditions to make our own traditions more rich and stimulating. So again, some people, I'm not going to say everybody, in the modern Orthodox community, they'll mesh both. You can have both, right? Like someone said, 18, 19-year-old Shiva student tells me, he says, listen, you go to a ball game, Camden Yards, Baltimore, right? You go to a ball game. So, seventh inning or fifth inning, whatever it is, they make an announcement for Mincha, right? Top of the afternoon service, behind the kosher stand. Peanuts, popcorn, Mincha, like, all you Jews come pray. So I said, listen, if you're at a ball game, right, it's got a point. If you're at a ball game, you can pray the afternoon service. Very good. Not to mention you get kosher food if it's really kosher. Okay. Yeah. But that's something you should be doing. That's a different issue. That's a different issue. But they won't see a problem with it. Some people. Yeah. Probably a lot of people wouldn't see a problem with it. Yeah, what's the problem? The only thing you tell me is a waste of time. I shouldn't be there. Oh, what people say and how they dress? Okay, it's another issue. But what's the main issue? Business Torah. I'm wasting time when I could learn Torah. Yeah. So in other words, you're combining two things. You got to pray with a minion. Very good. So I got a minion here. I can pray with a minion at the game. How much attention you're going to have? It doesn't matter. Right? Right? But the fact is, I can pray at the game. Good. You're combining both things. So again, someone say, well, if I go to a ball game and you're there, okay, so you pray with a minion. Good. Yeah, but you're combining both things. You're taking Torah, and say, prayer is important. We're going to pray. And you're going to say at the same time, I'm at a ball game. Do those two things mesh? I don't think so. Right? Someone's going to pin me down. Do they mesh? They don't mesh. They don't mesh. We don't need to borrow from their culture. It's interesting. It's fun. I want to go. I want to see. And you're going to say the biggest thing is only the waste of time to do it when I could have been learning if I was going to be learning. Okay. But at the end of the day, you don't want to combine both. So now you have a culture clash, right? You got a major clash with what we call Hellenism, right? Greeks, with Greek culture. Nonetheless, what did they teach? What does the Torah say? Let's say better. May the beauty of you have to reside in the tents of shame. Yeah. So meaning, I can take the beauty, right? I can take the outside world, I can sanctify it. Yeah. I shouldn't use it to utilize innovations and talents of other nations. In other words, Jewish people should be more insular. They should be working more on ethical and spiritual development. That's what they should be working on. So really, both are a contradiction, one and the other. But if I can use them, in tandem where they don't contradict, and I can get the benefit of both, which a lot of times we do. We're in this world. Yeah, we got to function in this world. Can I sanctify the physical? Absolutely. I can do that. Is it my ultimate goal, to bring both together? Not necessarily. There can be influence, which isn't good, right? But nonetheless, we don't want to take these negative things, even though we exist and we live in the physical world, right? That's true. So you have to navigate. You have to know how to navigate, in spiritual terms. I'm not to get sucked in. Okay, by these bad values. So even though it's there, I'm still going to dwell in the tents of shame. What are the tents of shame? Torah. But I'm not going to mix the two. That's the difference. I'm not necessarily going to mix the two. Now, can someone be, extremely religious and be a scientist? They can be. Can you see the greatness of God in science? Yes. Can you see it in astronomy? Yes. Right? I think I saw the Maral many, many years ago says, even so, most people are going to use, be in science and be into astronomy, they'll be heretics. Because they're not going to see that it comes from God. They're going to see it's nature. They're going to get caught up in nature. Yeah. If you can mesh the two in a way that you're going to come out even stronger in Torah, okay. Yeah. But the values don't necessarily mix. That's the problem. That is the problem. So my main, knock against modern Orthodox, again, it's not all of them by any stretch, right? I'll say that again. It's not by all of them. There are very, fine modern Orthodox Jews. There's no question, right? But my main thing will be you can't have 2 feet in the secular world and a quarter of foot in the religious world. It doesn't work. And it won't work, right? And you won't be able to produce Torah giants in the next generation because that won't be the focus. And most of the people won't focus on that, right? But the culture will clash. 100% the culture will clash. So the question is, how much of the culture am I going to let in? And sometimes you're surrounded by it, you have no choice, but you have to be focused. You absolutely have to be focused. If you're not focused, you get sucked in, right? Potentially. That's one reason. One way to explain it. Somebody asks, cleaving to God also mean cleaving to Tzaddikim? Yeah. It's also going after the righteous. Being close to righteous people. 100%. You're right. God has no body or form. That doesn't really matter, right? In other words, we got to be close to God. Can I give God a kiss? Can I hug him? I can't hug him, but I go in His way. Just like God is compassionate, we should be compassionate. Yeah. So we imitate what God wants from us, right? I shouldn't say imitate. We do what God wants from us. That's being close to Him, right? And being close to righteous people gives us the ability to be closer to God because you want to emulate what righteous people do. That's why the Gemara says in Chagiga, you want to learn from a rabbi, that rabbi to you has to be like an angel. Now, does that mean he's perfect? Well, it means perfect. Does that mean he doesn't make mistakes? Could make plenty of mistakes. Yeah? But they want to emulate what he represents, what he brings to the table. Yeah? Yeah, let me see. So that's what I would answer. For that, let me see any other questions? One thing I forgot to mention, I'll just mention that when it comes to, if a person's going to be, let's say, take on Sephardic tradition, right? Don't jump, and go from one thing to another. You want to be Sephardic, stay Sephardic. If you're going to change, you want to be Ashkenazic, you want to be Hasidic, okay. But when you make the change, you make the change. You don't want to, you don't want to keep different customs of different, different things. Because then it gets very confusing. Then it can be, very confusing. Stick to be one thing or the other. You want to be Litvish, be Litvish. You want to learn Hasidus, being Litvish, okay. You want to learn Sephardic things, you want to be Litvish, okay. But again, the main thing is you're keeping the customs of Ashkenazic Jewry. Yeah, but you're not bouncing around. Right? You want to, at this point, as a JIT, a person can bounce around if they want. They want to try this, they want to try that. That's fine. But once the person makes a decision, they should stick with it. What if they make a decision they're not happy? Yeah, let's say they're not happy. Okay, so they can change. They can change. Or let's say a person was brought up, and this happens. A person brought up Litvish, the Lithuanian Jew, and they feel they don't have inner Torah. They want to learn, Hasidic. They want to be more Hasidic. Okay. So the person decides to be more Hasidic. Can they do that? They can do it. Better to keep your own traditions, your family's tradition, but if it doesn't resonate with you, or whatever, a person wants to be, Hasidic, Sephardic, Breslov, whatever. I mean, as long as it's within the realm of Torah, you can do it. You can do it. Sometimes it's a clash in families, sometimes, right? And it can bring problems. But if it's gonna, if their soul is spoken to in that way, so then it's not a bad thing. They, obviously have to speak to parents about it, whatever. But if they're gonna go in that path, the parents have to let them go in that path. Can't stop them. If that's gonna draw them close to God, if it's again within the parameters. If it's within the parameters of Orthodox Jewry, okay. If it's not within the parameters, it's a different thing. You have to protest. You have to say something. You have an obligation to say something, right? But if it's that, or they're not going to be religious, then you'd be much happier they're non-Orthodox or Hasidic than if not. Then they're just, then they're nothing. Yeah. Any other? Let me see. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to stop here. I do this every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Israel time. Anyone has any questions, find me on Facebook at Chaim Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion in Judaism, orthodoxconversion.com, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube. There I got videos and Q&As, ethics for our fathers, Book of Leviticus. You want to send me an email, rabbichaimkaufman@gmail.com, RBBI, CHAIMCOFFMAN @gmail.com, whichever good beginning of the day, middle